FBI/CIA agents of Reddit, what is something that you can tell us without having to unalive us after? Worked with a woman who is former NSA. We would always beg her to tell us stuff, but she never did. The one thing she did say, though, was that during training, they showed them a video of a bunch of things they found out about and stopped. She said she hardly slept for 2 weeks after watching that. Just gonna throw that out there to begin with. I think we're gonna see a lot of "someone told me this" or "not a CIA/FBI agent, but." So just prepare for that. Story 2. I had a relative that retired from the NSA a few years ago. She has talked about a few things in generalities, nothing specific. Among them, you will see things that entirely change your view of the world. People go in there all the time with lofty goals of changing things, and within months, those goals are mostly gone. Still, if you want to change things, you work for the agency. If you want to make more money, you work for a contractor. No one cares what contractors have to say. Most people that stay long enough will do a tour and counter terrorism. Many people transfer out after a few months, and the average stay is 2 years because of the visuals. Those who stick around for a long time often change for the worse, and many struggle with mental illnesses, become alcoholics, get divorced, and generally lead miserable lives, with their work being the only reason for continuing. Alcoholism in general is rife in the agency. When you cannot speak to anyone outside the agency about your work, it becomes nearly impossible to confide in anyone close to you. Even if you have close work friends or family, you have to be careful what you say, because not everyone is read into every program. 2 people can sit next to each other in the same office working on the same subject for months and never talk about it, even though they're close friends outside of the agency. So people turn to the bottle. Her husband worked for a different government agency and also had a top-secret SCI clearance, but she couldn't talk about her work with him, nor could he with her. But his didn't involve the intelligence community. The agency employs psychiatrists who are cleared to be read into almost any program. Going to them, though, is often seen as a mark of shame among other agency employees, so they're not used nearly as often as they should be. She told me most of these things while trying to recruit me. She believed that I should go in knowing what to expect. I eventually declined to apply. I wonder what the mentality is behind that last point. Your work is incredibly mentally taxing. Therefore, your employer hires therapists for you, essentially. And then all of a sudden you're considered weak for going to them? That seems bad. I've never understood not seeking help like that, especially for something that hard. Or at least being shamed for seeking help like that. But hey, if the alcohol does the trick, I guess. Story 3. I talked with some CIA recruiters towards the end of college and almost applied earnestly after a large group Q&A, and then a much smaller one. The thing that stuck out to me was that the guy said most CIA agents are out of shape and have limited combat training with guns or hand-to-hand. They made it clear that it's the military who uses force. If confronted, they were trained to immediately surrender or to drop their bags and run if possible. Story 4. My sister is an intelligence officer who was assigned to a Special Forces FOB in Afghanistan for a period. She had to go through a gun qualification course and failed. This meant that she was not allowed to carry a firearm while deployed. The instructor told her that she was one of a very select group so bad at shooting that they couldn't pass, and then jokingly gave her a knife to carry. She spent the deployment doing whatever she does, some sort of analysis, and then hanging out around the gym so she could watch buff Special Forces guys lift. Story 5. 2 family stories, even though this will probably get buried. 1. My father's uncle told everyone for his entire life that he worked at a button factory. It was only revealed after his death that he in fact worked at a missile factory and assembled the gyroscopes for the guidance in missiles. 2. We always knew my grandfather worked for the government at the Pentagon. We never knew exactly what he did, but every 6 months or so he would call up to talk to my mom. The conversation was pretty much always the same. My mom and grandfather would catch up for a few, and then it would turn into, "So I have another clearance upgrade coming up. You will probably get a call like always. Just wanted to give you a heads up." A week later, some government agency would call up. It was always a different one, and ask for my mom. They would ask a bunch of questions, and that would be that. When he died from Alzheimer's at his funeral, 4 men in black suits attended, and no one knew who they were. After the burial, they approached his widow and handed her a plaque with 17 government agency symbols on it. Turns out he was responsible for interagency cooperation and training. He basically got everyone to talk to and teach each other. Now his son works for them, doing what? We don't know, and don't ask. Okay, I just thought of this, but is a predisposition for Alzheimer's or something actually a good thing in this line of work? You would just know all these secrets and then forget. No one could get them from you, even in your old age. Surely that's not something they actually look for, but it's just a thought I had. Story 6. My high school girlfriend worked for the National Reconnaissance Office after college. At the time, they were responsible for analyzing the nation's spy satellite photos. She told me 2 things. 1. There's a special garbage chute for classified materials. It's in the hallway. When you're new, as a hazing ritual, they tell you have to shout your badge number down the chute before throwing in any materials. This is hilarious. 2. She wouldn't tell me anything about the resolution quality of the spy photos, of course, but she did let it slip that because Russian sailors will sunbathe nude on the decks of their submarines in the Black Sea, several women in the office would pin those photos up in their cubicles as cheesecake beefcake photos. So a few decades ago, US spy photos could resolve Russian dongs. Story 7. Met an old, retired CIA spook at a wedding reception. Spitting image of Colonel Sanders. He was amazing. So I asked him, I don't want you to tell me anything you can't, but I would love to know. When Kennedy got assassinated, what was the talk around the water cooler in the office? He didn't halt or pause to think. Hell, we all thought Johnson did it. Story 8. Operation Ivy Bells was a plan to tap Soviet communication lines. The cover story they used was that they had divers diving down to recover fragments of a new Soviet supersonic anti-ship missile. The communication line tap was a failure due to a spy. However, the dive teams successfully recovered all fragments of the missile from the Soviet weapons test. The US was able to reverse engineer one and subsequently learned that they were radar-guided only, and the assumed IR guidance did not exist. Story 9. There's a book called Moscow Rules. It was written by 2 CIA people all about, well, disguise. The CIA had all these agents in Russia, but the Russians were insane about following literally every single American in Russia 24/7 looking for spies. So a huge part of their job was trying to shake off the KGB. They had crazy quick change disguises, all sorts of stuff. The movie Argo was based on one of the writers somewhat. Story 10. Not an FBI or CIA officer here, but my sister is a district attorney, and over the years she has prosecuted a number of animal cruelty cases. This led her to having an ongoing partnership with the FBI for the last several years. It turns out the FBI started tracking animal abuse cases about 10 to 15 years ago due to the incredibly high correlation between abusing animals when you're young and becoming a serial violent offender as an adult. Story 11. I have a few friends that are CIA officers. First thing is that the people that work for the CIA are not CIA agents, they are officers. The people they recruit to spy for them are agents. Also, going on a tangent, I'm 90% sure that I have been one of those agents when I was dealing with a Mexican logistics company while working at General Motors. The logistics company we were dealing with was owned by a multi-billion-dollar Mexican clan, and all the ultra-wealthy clans in Mexico all have ties to various cartels. So some federal agencies got involved, mainly FBI and I believe a few DEA. But one guy was specifically not wearing any badges, and was not willing to identify what agency he was working for. He questioned me on a lot of specific details of what the company's capabilities were. Though, getting back on track, anyone who is a US citizen can apply to join the CIA. It isn't that hard. If you have any kind of degree in computer science, statistics, engineering, or accounting, and don't have anything that would screw you up getting a clearance, getting a job would be relatively easy there. And as implied with that previous comment, working at the CIA is far more boring than you would think. Lots of tracing manufacturing capabilities, from what I described with that Mexican logistics company, to finding out how China sources the components they use to manufacture their satellites. Story 12. Not either of these, but I've had a clearance, so I can weigh in a little. 2 things. Firstly, most secret stuff happens right in front of people's faces under the guise of being normal everyday stuff. Secondly, properly secret programs and operations are never named in any way that indicates what they're actually about. They're generally just 2 words chosen at random that would rarely come up in normal conversation. Stuff like cracked gorilla, which I just made up off the top of my head. So when people talk about classified stuff and its name is super topical, it's either very, very old or a nickname at best. Only public programs and operations have topical names as a PR motive, like Desert Storm. Story 13. Not CIA, but have worked with and know guys in intelligence. Most of the intelligence we get is from OSINT, open source intel, stuff like news articles, press releases, news networks, and government announcements. Most people think that everyone in intelligence is some James Bond or Jason Bourne type of individual, when in reality the majority of analysts sit at a desk and go through the news articles all day. That said, it's not the only method we have to gather intel, but it is where most of it comes from. Even analysts that are using other methods spend their day cropping images for minute details, or replaying and monitoring the same signal over and over again. Story 14. My aunt has been an FBI agent for 25 years. The only thing I know about her job is that she's an office administrator, but her information went public somehow when she was part of the team that investigated the Mandalay Bay shooting in Las Vegas. Someone found the name and address of most of the agents that worked that scene and put it up online. Not sure why. She also took me and my family on a tour of the Las Vegas FBI headquarters about 15 years ago. One interesting thing I remember about the building is that all the doors were floor-to-ceiling 9-foot doors. I thought that was weird. Story 15. My ex was married to an FBI agent and was told many times about the insanely long interview period. She mentioned they went back to even interview his kindergarten teacher. She also told me that if there were truly anyone in your life that was a CIA agent, you would never know. They would truly be sworn to secrecy, and there would never be an instance of them casually mentioning or bragging, "Hey, I used to work at the CIA." Those people don't actually work for the CIA. So the idea anyone would comment here with actual connection with the agency is slim to none. The kindergarten teacher interview is interesting. I would have to assume it's because they want to check that they actually did indeed go to kindergarten and it's not a fabricated story, to make sure they're not from another country or something trying to steal info. That would be my best guess about that, because I don't think there would be much personality stuff you could glean from a kindergarten teacher. Like, can you imagine? This poor 70-something kindergarten teacher gets pulled into an interview room, like full-on interrogation room, and these men in suits and dark sunglasses are asking her, "So, tell us, did Jonathan share his toys as a kid?" Story 16. Not an FBI agent myself, but I was recently in frequent contact with an FBI recruiter about open positions I was considering. And what they told me was, the process of actually becoming an FBI employee usually takes between 1 to 2 years, for all the necessary background checks and training/exams. The FBI does all the stuff you see in the movies, just not as quickly. As I was watching some X-Files the night before the recruiter told me that, you can imagine that spooked me a bit. And lastly, special agents aren't spies, they're cops. Which is ultimately why I didn't decide to go forward with the application, since the initial info session made it seem like special agents had a more of a foreign/diplomatic role than they do, which is what drew me in the first place. Story 17. When I was 16, I became very close, very fast friends with this guy in my school choir. His dad went on business trips for his work at Lockheed Martin 3 or 4 times a month, always to Chicago. Me and this kid went everywhere together for about 3 months, after being very casual acquaintances for about 2 years. After school, we would hang out till 10 p.m. or so almost every night. We would get lunch at the same time and in the same place. We switched our class schedules to be in the same history or language arts sections, etc. Just your basic nerdy dudes finding a kindred spirit. I guess our sudden friendship raised an eyebrow or two because one day my friend came to school and said that his dad was asking him a lot of questions about me. Who my parents were, what my house was like, did he ever meet my siblings? Was I an obedient student or was I snarky? My buddy suspected the questions were being relayed from his dad's boss. Story 18. I have no idea if this is true, but it was recounted to me about 20 years ago by someone with epic credentials, and I've never heard the story in any other media. Before the Berlin Wall came down, Soviet radio operators used to carry their own activation keys for the military radio sets. There were slight differences in the electrical properties of each operator's key which minutely adjusted the broadcast signal properties. Even though the main radio equipment was dotted around the place, the Western powers were able to determine which keys were used, and so tracked individual operators by closely analyzing the transmission properties. The NATO listeners couldn't break the messages themselves, but the intel was still very useful. Normally, only a few Soviet operators were active in peacetime, but if there were tensions or military exercises planned, more would be brought in. One day, every operator started transmitting in relay. All of them were sending messages. It was a sign that something big was afoot, but the NATO commanders had received no advanced intelligence of any activity at all. This was highly unprecedented, unique even. They started to panic. Could it be the prelude to an attack? What were the Ruskies up to? Plans for counter scenarios and even possible first strike actions were warmed up, just in case the unthinkable happened. Then one of NATO's own radio operators noticed something strange. Radio equipment also had an identifiable broadcast fingerprint separate from the operator keys, and he noticed all the transmissions were originating from the same equipment at a single location close to the east-west border. He passed this information up the chain of command with a recommendation to send a spy plane over the top to see what was going on. One was immediately scrambled. The pictures that came back immediately pissed off the generals. The Ruskies were indeed using their operators to send messages from one location. Each operator was lining up in a long queue, entering a radio building, broadcasting a brief radio burst, then retrieving their key and moving to the back of the queue to wait for their next turn. But the shape of the line was what annoyed the military brass. The Russians had found out that their operators were being tracked and knew how NATO would react given the activity they created. The line snaking around the radio building was in the shape of a hammer and sickle. I don't know what the Russian is for screw you, but that was definitely the message on that picture. Of all the things in this story that make me think it's fake, it's actually the hammer and sickle part that does it the most for me. because that's just so over-the-top performative that I can't believe they would actually do that. Also, how do you form a Q with a hammer and sickle shape? That doesn't make any sense. Who goes next? Story 19. While in college, 78-79, this textbook in my poli-sci class told of a time when Nixon was in office. He demanded to leave the White House to go to a musical. Unplanned, no prep or anything. Major crap storm for Secret Service. Eventually, they got Nixon to calm down and they never went out. One of our close new neighbors happened to work for the Secret Service. His family came over to our family home for dinner one evening. Eventually, it came out that he worked on the Nixon detail a few years back. That's when I shared my story I read in my textbook. He actually almost dropped his fork and sat there with his mouth wide open. Apparently, the story was not only true, but was supposed to be a secret. I showed him my book and he notated the author. I have no idea the outcome, but it made the night more interesting. Story 20. My grandfather was CIA. We all knew better, no one asked. Over time, as his assignments became unclassified, he would slowly tell little stories. Was eating dinner. He asks my mom, "You remember that time y'all dropped me off at Dulles Airport? I actually flew to Camp Perry, and was then helicoptered overseas." My mom replied, "Which time?" Turns out he was demo expert, defused bombs, spent 30 years all over the world. His claim to fame? Tokyo Rose used to call him personally every time he landed in Japan. Man never traveled under his real name. I'm glad we're ending it on probably the most realistic one here. Well, at least one of the most realistic ones, because look, these people can't tell you anything. They're super secret whatevers for a reason, because the stuff they do is super secret. That means they don't tell people. So it makes sense that he could only say stuff as it became declassified. Grandpa being overseas defusing bombs, though, that's sick. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day or night wherever you are, and I will see you in the next one.